The texts for today are from Isaiah and Matthew, and also a book by Ron Say. I don't know if you remember Ron Say, called Tai Chi Chuan, The Internal Tradition. Not that that's as sacred as the other texts, but it's in the mix. Tai Chi. Riding the wave before the punch is critical. Before the hand comes a field, a wave of pressure that can move the dodger ahead of it. One must cultivate a quality of lightness. One must be sensitive like a feather in the wind, yet firmly planted in the ground, continually listening to one's partner. From the time that I was 3 years old, through my teen years, my family spent many summer vacations at Red Rock Crossing near Sedona, Arizona. You know Oak Creek Canyon? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Every day we climbed on the rocks, played in the creek. Every day was very much the same, and yet very different. Every day the sun rose behind the black shadow of Cathedral Rock, and in the heat of the day we would make pools by moving rocks, and we would float in inner tubes down rushing channels. Every afternoon at 3 o'clock, a thunderstorm would drive us out of bathing suits and into town clothes. We would go into Sedona on the wet, red roads to buy groceries for dinner and collect bottle caps from the soda machines. Remember those? And every evening, after the storm would drift away and the inevitable sunset would catch Cathedral Rock on fire with its own color, after dinner was cleaned up and the red-hot coals of the campfire had settled into the dirt, we would go to sleep in the deep, damp darkness, bright with stars and the sounds of crickets. Every day, the world of Oak Creek would change, affected by our play, affected in spite of our play. We would move rocks. The water would shift them again, slowly taking away the rough edges and then the smooth ones. The rain would fall drop by drop on each leaf and stone, carrying tiny pieces of the great cathedral into the creek, tumbling with them down and down and down, surrendering to the natural motion, resting momentarily by our feet, and then tumbling on down the canyon. We may have noticed from year to year the abrupt appearance, delicate changes, but if we noticed things at all, we noticed most the changes in ourselves from year to year. We noticed how fragile and small things looked because we were older or bigger or touched by important moments that had moved us from one state of being to another, from one consciousness to a new awareness. One summer evening when I was still very young, my brother Todd and I found a man down the road. The man seemed old to us. When you're little, lots of people seem old. Didn't have much hair, and he was seated, working on something with his hands, close to the ground and close to us. The man had stretched 2 ropes between 2 trees. Between the ropes, he had stretched a flat white sheet. Behind the sheet, he had placed the brightest lantern we'd ever seen. We were drawn through the trees to the large expanse of white, much like the moths were drawn to perch on that sheet and enjoy the curiousness of light in the center of the vast darkness and the sound of crickets. What I remember most were the sizes and colors of the night moths that hovered on that square of light. Huge moths with cool pastel colors rippling across fragile wings that moved softly and silently in the night. I had always thought that moths were those tough little white things that ate our sweaters in the dresser drawer. But these were beyond imagination. They were immense in my mind and in the light. And they flew with me into my future years and into the past when I wandered there in search of identity and meaning and answers to the abrupt and delicate changes inside of me. Tai Chi. It is sad, but true, that having an enemy gives us credentials, a reference point. I know I exist because someone else is fighting me. narrowly defined boundaries establish their existence. Space is terrifying. There have always been conflicts, wars, people who considered other people their enemy. There is a certain sense of identity that comes from being in opposition to something else. Much of my early theological identity, my ideas about God, were formed in opposition to things I was being taught in seminary. But how pale those ideas seem now in comparison to those that have shaped my consciousness since then. Many centuries ago, a man lived, a man whose sense of identity was shaped by his people, a man whose compassion and sense of justice went deep, a man whose response to oppression was personal and communal, prophetic and poetic. He took on the identity of Israel and wrote these words from the exile in Babylon, as if Israel were he and he were Israel. Isaiah 50. The Lord God has given me the tongue of those who are taught, that I may know how to sustain with a word him that is weary. Morning by morning he wakens my ear to hear as those who are taught. The Lord God has opened my ear, and I was not rebellious. I turned not backward. I gave my back to the smiters, and my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. I hid not my face from shame and spitting, for the Lord helps me. Therefore I have not been confounded. Therefore I've set my face like a flint, and I know that I shall not be put to shame. He who vindicates me is near. Who will contend with me? Let us stand up together. Who is my adversary? Let him come near to me. Behold, the Lord God helps me. Who will declare me guilty? Behold, all of them will wear out like a garment. The moth will eat them up. Israel had no power when they were in exile, except the power of surrender. Within surrender was groundedness, an identity based not on opposition, but on surrender itself. Surrender in relationship to God and to self and to one another. Once liberated from physical captivity and exile, Israel knew who she was. And her captors, the Babylonians, found that the instability of power over others toppled them. They lost their balance and their identity, their groundedness, the integrity of the fabric of their being. The moth will eat them up, Israel said. Those giant moths in the night that have no power but their beauty and their cover of darkness and their identity and their will to survive and their instinct to find the light. In her vulnerability, Israel survived. Israel was changed, but she endured. Tai Chi. When our partner goes into reaction over what we are doing or what we represent, we can steer him to his own defeat. If we meet another's movement with resistance, we disclose what we identify with, that which is vulnerable, and give our partner the route that leads to it. The priority is to not resist the intention of our partner, but to be elusive, to disappear. 5 centuries after the fall of Babylon, another man lived. A man whose sense of identity was shaped by his people. A man whose compassion and sense of justice went deep. A man whose response to oppression was personal and communal, prophetic and poetic. This man identified with his ancestors in faith. Within him were Moses and David and Esther and Rachel and Zechariah and Isaiah. Isaiah of the exile. Isaiah, whose poetry pounded in his chest like an enormous moth in rhythm with his heartbeat, accelerating as Jesus approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage, to the Mount of Olives. Jesus knew that he would die someday. We all do. We all know that, right? He knew that he would die, but he may not have known that it would be in less than a week. He may not have known that death was so near, but he knew that death hovers in every moment, and the danger lurked in the shadows of that roadside, the shadowed streets of Jerusalem. Jesus knew that his opposition to the occupation of his country by Rome and his historical claim to the throne had drawn the attention of an armed force that promised to annihilate him. He also knew that his teachings had been unusual, that his actions had broken traditional religious laws, that his miracles of healing and affirmation had startled some vulnerable members of the religious hierarchy in occupied Jerusalem and brought them into positions of defensiveness. He knew that his inexplicable connection to God created fear in those who could explain everything but that. Jesus knew that his cultic raising of Lazarus from the dead, his final and most desperate attempt to connect his friends, his people, his community to the sacredness of their own relationship with God and with each other, he knew that this ritual resurrection of Lazarus had created self-proclaimed enemies. His own identity revealed drove others to seek their identity in opposition, and he was now in danger. His self-proclaimed enemies were projecting their own ugliness onto the one they feared, accusing him of seeking power over others, accusing him of undermining their established order, their sense of meaning and reason, their relationship to the holy and each other. It is understandable that even if a point of view seems skewed to someone else, it can be the foundation and rock and ground of being for the person holding that point of view. It is frightening to have that foundation rocked, challenged, shifted, pulled out from under us. Identity and balance are lost, and in order to regain equilibrium, a person might have to find a new ground, a new identity in opposition to the perceived enemy. Jesus knew his danger. He listened well. He'd heard his people deeply. Accused of seeking power, he lifted Zechariah's familiar words from their common past into their common present. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Your king comes to you. Triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on an ass, on a colt, the foal of an ass. Direct quote from Zechariah. Isaiah's words pounded in his chest. The Lord God has opened my ear, and I was not rebellious. I turned not backward. I gave my back to the smiters. Zechariah's passion pounded like wings in his mind, and Jesus surrendered to the attack of his self-styled enemies, grounding his power in humility, trading their kingly horse and chariot for his baby donkey, arriving under their expectations and catching them off guard, off balance, without resistance, with his own identity intact. Tai Chi. Thich Nhat Hanh teaches that if I'm told by another that I am ugly or unworthy, I am moved. Mere words affect me, actions more so. Not that I am ugly or that another would try to hurt me so. We are connected deeply. We are one being at war with itself. Those that would attack Jesus and those who praised him and called upon him to save them were the same people. Many had been present at the resurrection of Lazarus. Some reported his influence and power in the community to their Roman superiors. Others were afraid and ran to report the blasphemous miracle to the priests. Some became believers and wanted Jesus to touch and heal them too. Hosanna, they cried, save us too. All those present were moved, were changed. Each one was changed differently, minutely, imperceptibly, utterly. Each one was changed. All were connected, deeply, inextricably. The people of Jerusalem, those in the streets and those who stayed home, the temple hierarchy, Jesus, the disciples, the Roman soldiers, all of the people of Jerusalem at that moment were one being at war with itself. All were moved, changed, transformed, whether they noticed it or not. And the world itself shifted, bringing into focus more authentic ways of being, offering a clarified vision, a direct relationship with God, an identity based not at all on opposition to another, not at all on resistance to that which is different, not at all on weakness or inferiority, but grounded in the strength of sacred beingness, moving on fragile and powerful toward the light through the surrounding darkness, surrendering to a larger self that includes all that is. Tai Chi. A warrior can cut through the garbage, he didn't really say garbage, but I won't say the word, and touch another's tenderness. The part that loves children feels pain and would rather be friends. To do so takes power. A warrior walks his talk. We have to be in touch with that part of us that loves children, feels pain, and would rather be friends. With the power of surrender, I need not kill or even hurt. My adversary's flame will die all by itself. I need not interfere. When Jesus entered Jerusalem sitting on the donkey, the city stirred, saying, "Who is this?" And the people said, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee." Jesus knew who he was. He knew his power, did not have to prove it to anyone anymore. They knew because he knew. Jesus knew his power and knew that he was connected deeply to all those who loved him and all those who feared him and all those who feared loving him. He knew that people are not only their present selves, but all history as well. That the ways of ancestors become present instincts, that ancient metaphors become the mystery of tradition, that the will to survive is often twisted into the lust for power over others, that fear feeds itself, that evil only grows in opposition to resistance. Jesus knew that fire dies without fuel or air, that momentum is lost when the ground is level, that survival is more likely in an atmosphere of trust and compassion, that the past does not just haunt the present, the past shapes the minds of those who look to God for identity and meaning. The past is where our roots reach and where our power comes from. As long as we live in the present and press with vulnerability and humility and joy with one another toward the future. The self-identified enemies of Jesus could not prove their ungrounded fears. Their accusations were left hanging like a white sheet in the dawn, tattered and torn by time and the pounding wings of 1,000 moths. The enemies of Jesus ate with him one night and slept among his prayers in the garden. The enemies of Jesus walked with him to Calvary, pounded in the nails, gambled at his feet, wept at his wounding, and died with him on the cross. The enemies of Jesus were blessed by him and rose with him and walked with him in the garden by the tomb. The enemies of Jesus were a part of Jesus, are a part of each one of us. The enemies of Jesus would rather be friends and don't know how, but are being changed and transformed every moment by every word and breath, every drop of rain and touch of sunlight, every act of surrender and every insight into self, every revelation that each one of us is part of each other one of us. Each one of us is the enemy and the best friend of Jesus. When we are at war with each other, we are at war with ourselves and must look within for the answer, for peace. Tai Chi. The immediacy of life is available when one lives with the awareness of death. We do not have time to spend in confusion. During my last semester in college, I discovered an author who reshaped my identity, and his name was Vladimir Nabokov. Some people call him Vladimir Nabokov. Vladimir Nabokov, a Russian-European-American author who wrote novels and short stories with titles like Ada, Panin, Lolita, Palefighter. His poetry reached out with metaphors and colors that touched and lured and opened and transformed my imagination, my soul. Through his paragraphs and chapters, there was a thread of light that kept drawing me forward in the darkness, wanting more, seeking an understanding of the depth and beauty of his perspective on the world. In every book and story, butterflies populated the landscape. A man would wander past or be seen sitting at another table, his butterfly net propped against the wall. Nabokov, the author, was also a lepidopterist. a butterfly specialist. He, in fact, discovered a species never before identified, which is named for him. I had plans to go and meet this man who then lived in Sweden, having moved there from New York. I was going to sit at his feet, eat his bread, wander in the meadows of his mind, and bask in his light. But only months after my graduation from college, I received a telegram from a friend telling me that Nabokov had died. I grieved deeply and felt that I had lost a part of me that was essential and irretrievable. To console myself, I picked up one of his novels, opened to the preface, and began to read. As I reached the end of the preface, I noticed that it was dated early in my childhood and located by the words Oak Creek Canyon, Sedona, Arizona. My heart beat faster, just like now. There was a pounding of enormous wings about my head and a square of light wavering through the darkness, stretched between two trees, as a mysterious old man called to the night butterflies with his light, and called two children who hovered like moths at the edge of his presence, two children, one of whom was changed forever by the fluttering wings of his words, the magic of his light, his deference to the ephemerality of moths, the humility of his being, his surrender to his love of life and beauty, and his longing to find language for the sacred, the holy, the human. Tai Chi. One must cultivate a quality of likeness. One must be sensitive like a feather in the wind, yet firmly planted in the ground, continually listening to one's partner. The disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them, and they brought the colt and put their garments on it, and he sat there on it. And somewhere in the heart of Jesus, Isaiah whispered, "Who will contend with me? Let us stand up together. Who is my adversary? Let him come near to me. Behold, all of them will wear out like a garment. The moth will eat